Here with more insight, Greg Fields, investment advisor at Gerber Kawasaki Wealth and Investment Management. Greg, thanks so much for joining us. Can you walk us through these sanctions from the president and their intended impact? We know the first round of sanctions were really meant to send a message. How have things escalated with this new round?
Well, good morning. First of all, thanks for having me. Essentially, there are two sets of new sanctions that Biden proposed yesterday. One was basically sanctioning the 10 largest Russian banks and basically making it very difficult for them to have transactions with the rest of the world. And the other set of transactions was basically blocking U.S. high-tech exports into Russia. And when I talk about that, you're saying, semiconductors. These are basically used in high-tech applications, things like military, industrial purposes.
Do we believe that this next round of sanctions will actually deter Putin from causing even more damage moving forward? We've heard from some guests on the show that say he could potentially be willing to take this pressure at the risk of his own people and feel the pain that some of the Western nations are trying to impose at this point in an effort to gain control of Ukraine. Do we think this is enough?
Well, sanctions are never enough. It's part of a larger package that the Biden administration has put together. You're talking about arming the Ukrainians with Javelin missiles, Stinger missiles. You're talking about some maybe covert action that we don't even know about yet on the ground in the Ukraine. But the sanctions themselves, by themselves, are not enough to deter Putin from what he's doing. And it's unfortunate because really they're Ukrainian people and the Russian people that are going to pay the price for this, incursion into Ukraine.
Yeah, definitely. And you talk about some of the Ukrainian response as far as defense goes. What defense capabilities does the country actually have at this point? We know civilians have really played an instrumental role in defending a lot of the territory and are even being called at this point to take up arms, to get their own firearms, to enlist, and also to make Molotov cocktails.
Right. All right. Yeah. That's interesting because 300,000 veterans of the Donbass wars have basically said that they're going to participate in trying to repel this invasion. The first thing that Putin did was take a page from the old, Warsaw Pact playbook in Poland and Hungary and take out the command and control centers from the conventional military. But there's also 130,000 volunteers basically trained in guerrilla warfare. And I think that's pretty interesting. If it's 100,000 or 130,000 last June, imagine how many it is now. And, you think about Afghanistan, Vietnam, these are all great cases for the power of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, let's talk about the impact that we're seeing on the markets. Initially, when the news broke of the invasion, they really tumbled. And we saw a bit of a rebound yesterday with power behind things like defense stocks. How do you think the long-term impact will be on the markets and the global economy? Do you think it's going to continue to remain volatile at this point, or is there any sort of equilibrium that investors could come to or potentially price in a lot of this global tension we're feeling?
Well, first of all, we shouldn't forget about the impact on the Russian markets. The Russian stock market dived 38% yesterday. And interestingly, Putin called this meeting of all the largest sort of kleptocrats that he's appointed at these banks and Gazprom, the oil, monopoly, and basically to peel them off the ceiling because they're so concerned. Now, in terms of the global markets, oil is the obvious commodity that's going to be most affected, right? Because there's predictions that oil may hit $125 a barrel by the summer. And that's obviously not going to be good for U.S. consumers. Europe is going to be hit even worse because they depend on about 40% of their natural gas comes from Russia. Germany basically stopping the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was really taking one for the team. But I would say generally, if we have a hot war and there's all this unpredictability, that's just going to create more, anxiety about inflation, It's basically going to just create more and more volatility and worry.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned inflation because it's worth remembering, even as we're covering all of this developing, we're still trying to dig out of the pandemic. So, what happens if this war extends beyond Ukraine to neighboring countries and even to NATO allies?
Well, then we're in World War III. That's a whole different animal. For the time being, the problem is economically that we already had a supply chain that was really backed up, and now we're going to add to that, Russia's contributions in palladium and nickel and aluminum, and that's going to spike commodity prices. I mean, if you're a commodities investor, you're probably really happy right now, but if you're buying commodities, it's not going to be so great.
Greg Fields, investment advisor for Gerber Kawasaki Wealth and Investment Management. Appreciate this insight. Thanks so much for joining us.